Thanks, Kat. Hey, crew, good to see you guys. My name's Nathan, one of the pastors here. If I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, greetings. Everybody in the cheap seats on Labor Day, what's up? Good to see you. Everybody joining us online. Hey, we're celebrating communion today, so now's your chance to run to the pantry and get whatever you have. Whatever it takes, whatever you have in the refrigerator or the pantry, give you a heads up. We're going to do that just as a faith family. I want you to be a part of it as well with us. Just us here. We can be honest with each other. It's not going to hurt my feelings very much. Raise your hand if you've ever fallen asleep in church before. Not this church. I'm talking about other churches that you used to go to. Okay, yeah, right. So, yep. Not me. My dad was my pastor, and he's watching online. What's up, Dad? I never fell asleep in church. Riveting all the time. During the songs, maybe, but never during the message. We had a guy. I'm not going to tell you what campus it was on. This was 5 or 6 years ago, but it was in Rural Hall. So there's that. Okay. All right. So back up. I'm not going to tell you what campus it is. North Campus. But we had a guy that he worked the third shift, and Pastor Wesley at the time was telling me this story. He worked the third shift, and he would come in, get off of work, and come directly to church on Sundays. And so I was fired up about that. I was like, man, that's awesome, man. You work all night long, and instead of going home and going to bed, before you do that, you're going to come to church. And so he said he would sit, if you've ever been to the North Campus up in Rural Hall, he would sit on the left-hand side up against the wall, his seat up against the wall. And Wes said, man, he'll sing during the worship, and it's awesome. But he said, but during the message, he sat down with me during staff meeting. He said, hey, man, I need for you to help me brainstorm something because during the message, this guy would fall asleep. And I can see everybody. I know the lights are bright, but I can see all of your faces. So if you're sleeping, I know that you're sleeping. It hurts my feelings. I try not to show it, but I can see you. And so Wes is I get it, man. He's third shift, and so I'm just glad he's there, man. I'm just glad that he's worshiping and just glad to be in the room. But he said, but here's the problem. He snores. And it's loud. And Wes said, I need to know, what to do. What do you do, man? I need some help. I was like, well, did you try, during exciting parts of the message, if you, slap your hands and get hey, let's go, and, does that wake you up? Or if you want to, slap the table a little bit, or whatever, don't be too Pentecostal, don't be scaring people, but, enough to wake a slumber. And he's like, dude, I've tried all of that. I said, well, does anybody else notice? And he said, Nathan, you don't understand, man. I'm looking out into the audience, and everybody is looking at this person. I said, well, does no one think to, nudge him? And he said, well, here's the problem. The way the room is set up, he sits over here up against the wall, and so no one sits close enough to him to be able to wake him without getting up and walking over there. And I guess everybody just thinks that would be even more of a distraction, and so we can't do that. And so for 35 minutes, I was like, well, preach shorter sermons, bro. 35 minutes. This dude is snoring loudly. And I don't know what happened to him. He doesn't go to Revo anymore. Maybe he scared him off. I don't know what happened. But I want to tell you a story today out of Acts chapter 20 about a dude that fell asleep during the sermon. Now, I take great comfort in this because in Acts chapter 20, the Apostle Paul is preaching a sermon. It happens to the best of them, baby. It's not just me. People fell asleep during Paul's sermon. And in Acts chapter 20, if you have your Bibles, you can open it up your app, and it'll be there. If you have your Acts journal, it'll be in there too. I want to tell you the story of this dude that fell asleep. Can you imagine getting your name in the Bible and you were the dude that fell asleep in church for thousands of years? Be like, well, we're going to get to heaven one day. We're going to be like, Eutychus? You're the dude that fell asleep during Paul's sermon? I've heard all about you. Acts chapter 20, starting in verse 7. It says, on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. Yikes. Sunday, he's preaching, Paul, preaching machine. He's leaving to the next city the next day, and he's just I feel like they want to hear some more. I feel like they're dialed in. And so now he is extending. You see how nice of that was of Luke to put that? I hope when I go long, sometimes y'all will be like, well, he just extended his message slightly. He extended it until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. You gotta love it. Luke's like, look, I love Paul. I love Jesus, but I don't even want to be in church that long. Like, he's still talking, still preaching. It's midnight. Like, forget being late for lunch. We're getting ready to start another day here, and we are still in church. And being overcome by sleep, Eutychus fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. That's what you get for sleeping in the church, man. All right. So, verse 10, but Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him in his arms, he said, that's what you get for sleep. No, he didn't say that. That's what I would have said. Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him, right? He died, but Paul's like, chill, man. I'm getting ready to raise this dude back to life, okay? Calm down, everybody. Like, I'm going to finish the sermon. I know you want me to, but let me do this first. And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth, Eutychus, they took him away alive, and were not just a little bit comforted by what had happened. Now, if anybody were to fall asleep during a sermon of mine, I would do the same thing that Paul did. If you were in the balcony and you fell asleep and you tumbled forward and you died, I would raise you back to life. Not immediately, though. I would use it as a teaching opportunity. I would use it as an opportunity to share with everybody else why you need to be taking your notes and jotting down your app and paying attention. Don't fall asleep during the message. But Paul took this opportunity, seized it, and I think it's so interesting that immediately after Paul raised this guy from the dead, it says he walked back upstairs, and the very next thing they did was take communion. It's interesting. I think Paul seized on an opportunity. I think Paul had an illustration fall into his lap from a windowsill, and he took this time to say, hey man, this is a great illustration. There was a guy that was dead, and then he's risen back to life, and I climbed 3 stories up to the top of the building, 3 days, 3 stories. There's all kind of connections here. Why don't we talk about Jesus? Why don't we talk about the resurrection? Why don't we celebrate communion together? And so he tied all of that together, and that's what I want to do. I want to take a story out of Acts 20 about a man that fell out of a window from a long-winded sermon. I mean, Paul literally bored this man to death, and he fell out of the window and died. Paul resurrected him back to life, and it served as a good illustration of what Jesus did. And so Paul just kind of called an audible. He's like, man, we got any bread in the refrigerator back there? Get all the juice and the wine and get all that out, and let's take a minute and remember. Let's remember not only what happened today, because that was cool. We just raised that guy back from the dead. Eutychus will never forget that moment, but let's remember what Jesus has done for us. That's the language that Jesus used when he enjoyed the Last Supper with his disciples. He said, every time you do this, I want you to do it in remembrance of me. You need to remember certain things whenever you do this. And the reason why Revo does this the way that we do it, I don't know if you've ever noticed communion around here. We do all of the songs around communion and pointing us towards this moment where we explain the bread and we explain what the blood was and the sacrifice and why we do that together. Like, we do our whole service around it. And we don't do it every Sunday. I'm not knocking churches that do, but there's this fear that I have that such a special and significant moment in the life of Jesus would somehow become ordinary and routine if we just happen to do it all of the time. And so we do it the way that we do it just because we want to make sure that we put all of the focus on it, that we teach on it, that we really take some time to remember to do what Jesus told us to do. Every time you do this, every time you take this, do it in remembrance of me. So I want to share with you 3 things before we come up to the table and get the elements. I want to share with you 3 things that I think Jesus was talking about when he said remember. What do we remember? What does this meal help us to do? Where should we be looking? What directions? What things should be coming to our mind when we remember? So first one is this. When we stop to remember, it gives us an opportunity to experience what God is doing all around us. When we hit the pause button on a service like this and take communion and explain it and go through it and hold these physical elements in our hands, it's an opportunity to take a break from the ordinary service, the order, the songs, the makeup, everything about it, and just to hit the pause button, to experience it. To look around us. At this point in the book of Acts, it's been about 25 years since Jesus died and resurrected. This young church is about 25 years old, expanding like crazy. Church plants are popping up everywhere, and disciples are being made, people getting led to Christ. And man, we're seeing some great things, life change through Jesus happening all around us every single day. And even in this setting, so many people had shown up to this house to worship Jesus, to hear Paul preach, that we literally have people hanging out of the windows. Like, it's not standing room only, it's like sitting on the window sills and standing outside, peering in through open doors and open windows. People were so hungry for it. They wanted to know. Like, so many people had shown up that Paul's just like, through midnight, I know he joked about it, but like, he's preaching all night long, and people are just like, yo, give it to me. Like, I want it. This is so good, man. Help me to know Jesus more and to move forward in that relationship. I mean, communion is a chance to pause, even for the people in that room, to pause and look at what God was doing. Man, we got a packed house. Man, God's still doing miracles in our midst today. Did you see that guy? He fell out of the balcony, and the pastor just walked down the stairs and healed him and walked back up, and now we're doing communion. This is wild. Like, God's hand is moving. There's some things that are happening in your life right now. And I know the tendency for me is I'm so busy. I'm so focused on tomorrow. I'm such a person that's wanting to grow and continue. And like, what happened in the past, that's great. But what's next? What's the next hill to climb? What's the next mountain to take? That sometimes we can forget just to hit the pause button and realize that God is answering prayers all around us, that God is blessing us, that God is doing things in our midst. And I don't want to miss it. And so communion hits the pause button. When we remember the sacrifice of Jesus, it causes us to sit back and understand what God is doing in our midst right now. Like what's unfolding today, September 1st, in your family and in your home, in this city. Amazing to reflect on even what God is doing right now. The second thing we got to stop and remember in communion is it connects us with all that God has done. God is moving in your midst right now and opening doors and blessing you and doing things in your life. But really, man, if you hit the pause button on communion, it's a dinner that was first celebrated 2,000 years ago. It's in the past. And 2,000 years of faithfulness that God has shown. 2,000 years of his provision. I guarantee that no one in that room forgot what happened that day. If you were in attendance on the infamous day where Eutychus fell out of the window and died, and Paul walked down and resurrected him, and then only to walk upstairs and finish his sermon, I guarantee you were still talking about that. I know that because here we are 2,000 years later, and we're talking about it. We're still reminiscing about this story. We're still learning from this story. And so even that story, people would have recalled it. Hey, remember that time that Eutychus fell out the window. Remember that time that God used that pastor to heal that guy. And then we remembered what Jesus had done for us and the parallels between the resurrection. And man, like, isn't that crazy what God has been doing? Remember the day that the church was packed that day. I mean, that was the reason why the guy fell out of the window. Like, there was no room for him inside. Maybe somebody just leaned back and accidentally pushed him out. I don't know what happened. But God's been doing some incredible things. Think about God's faithfulness, what he's done in your life. And so when Jesus emphasized remembering when we take communion, that was a practice for us to hit the pause button and look back. Look back on God's faithfulness, on God's provision. Now, they didn't have communion in the Old Testament, obviously. Jesus hadn't come yet. But there was an act that God told his people to do that was focused on remembering. And the one particular thing that he called his people to do is to build altars. Anytime God did something amazing, God provided in a supernatural way. Anytime a battle was won and the Lord delivered them, anytime that God showed up, the people would take up rocks and they would build an altar. It was like a table out of rocks. And they would sacrifice an animal on top of the altar as worship unto the Lord. And they would remember, they would name the altars. Like they would name the altar after what happened that day or what God did or something that marked a characteristic of God. And here's the interesting thing about the altars. When the people would move on, think back in the Old Testament when they were wandering through the wilderness for 40 years, they built altars along the way every time God provided. When they left, they would leave the altar set up. And so there was an opportunity to look back on the journey that these Israelites had been on for 40 years, and every few miles there would be a huge pile of rocks. And it would be an opportunity for generations to come to look back, and grandparents would point altars out to their kids and say, you know, guys, listen, it was here that God revealed himself to your great-grandfather, and God provided in a supernatural way. And those rocks serve as a reminder. It's an opportunity for us to stop and think and look back at the faithfulness of God, to be reminded of it. A few years ago, we were in staff meeting, and I gave all of our staff a rock like this. And I said, I want you to take this rock, and I challenged some of them to think about God's faithfulness in the past, prayers that he's answered, things that he's done in your life, doors that he's opened, ways that he's blessed you. And some of the staff members, they wrote those things on the rock. And I say, hey, put your rock on your desk or somewhere at your home where you can remember it. And we got like staff members that went out and bought more rocks. And we've got it's like shrines they have set up at their house now. But it's like an altar that they would remember the faithfulness of God. And they can pick up every rock, and there's a story written on the rock of God's faithfulness. That's what communion does for us. It's an opportunity to think back on God's faithfulness, think back on God's provision. See, remembering the past gives us faith for today, but it also gives us courage for the future. Sometimes you just need to stop and remind yourself of all that God has done to let you know that he's still in control, that he still has a plan, that you can trust him for what he hasn't done yet. And that's communion as well. Communion reminds us of the love of God, the sacrifice of God. Communion reminds us of even of our darkest times where our sin was placed on Jesus. He paid the price for those things. So that happened in the past, even for the sins that you have not confessed, that you have not committed yet, all of those are paid for by this. And so sometimes you got to stop, hit the pause button, and remind yourself of what God has done in the past to prepare you for what he's going to do next. That's the last thing that I want to challenge you to remember this morning. When we stop to remember, it gives us confidence in what God will do. The reality is everybody in this room has prayers and desires that are unmet right now. You've been praying, you've been asking. Some of you are at the point where you're ready to give up, where you just don't know if it's going to work, where you don't know if it's even worth praying anymore about. And sometimes our faith can waver like that, and we need to have times in our life where we hit the pause button and sit back and remember what happened so that it can instill some fuel in our hearts for what God hasn't done yet. He hasn't done it yet, but I'm still trusting. I'm still believing. People could have walked out of that building at night, whether they left at midnight after the healing or they left at 6 a.m. the next day as Paul continued to preach. They would have walked out with a renewed confidence in God's power. Man, did you see what God just did? Did you see what just happened? Man, that gets me fired up, man. I'm believing God to resurrect some things in my life. And I just saw him resurrect a guy physically. And then we remembered when he resurrected Jesus physically after 3 days. And man, I'm starting to believe again. I'm starting to have some confidence again. Sometimes we hit the pause button to give us confidence on what God will do. I've shown some people this before, but I've got this red journal notebook that's sitting in a bookshelf in my office. And there's a verse in Hebrews chapter 11 and 12 that talks about what faith is. And the definition of faith in Hebrews 11 and 12 is faith is the belief in things that are not yet seen. See, every person in here is believing and trusting God for something that hasn't happened yet, for something that is not yet seen. It hasn't happened. You haven't seen it. You don't know when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, what it's going to look like, but you're still believing. And so I bought this notebook almost 10 years ago, and I took a Sharpie and I wrote on the front of it, things unseen. And so I decided that occasionally throughout the year, I would write down prayers in this book. I would write down people's names, specific situations and circumstances that I was praying for, things that had not happened yet, but things that I was believing God for. And I would write down those things. And the first one I looked at this morning, the first entry that I made was in August of 2015. And so I began to look through these things, just things that God was teaching me, ways that I feel like God was calling me to trust in him, and people to pray for, things to ask God for. And man, even just this week, just little pieces of paper that I had jotted down and stuck in this, because I wanted to make sure that I wrote down the things that I was asking God for, because something amazing happens. God hears your prayers, and God answers your prayers. And as I read through this book over the past 10 years, and I flipped page after page after page of, I'm not talking about random happenstance, like specific things that I asked God for to happen in specific ways with specific people in specific timelines. And to read these and to realize that God answered them is like jet fuel for your faith. Like this week, I read through this book again and started to get that crazy feeling that we could do anything. Better watch out, like dangerous, man. Starting to think that God can do anything, that God's not done yet, that God can use us to allow us to see and reach more people than we've ever reached, and resurrect some things that seem to be dead in people's lives right now. It's good to step back and remember what God has done in the past, because it serves as jet fuel for your faith moving forward. Like occasionally, you just need somebody to fan the flame. Paul talked about that with Timothy, man. You got to fan the flame of your faith, because there's times where the fire grows dim and you need to stop and think about who God is and what he's done in his faithfulness and his provision, and the times that he's blessed you, and the times where all you had was prayer. And then when all you had was prayer, you realized the only thing you needed was prayer, and God answered. And you need to remind yourself of those things. That's what communion does. It reminds us of what God has done in the past, so that after we take this communion, we're a family that leaves with great faith, believing God for even more in the future. Yeah, if God could raise a dude that fell out the window of Paul's 3-story house in the middle of a sermon, then maybe God can take this in my life and do something with it. Maybe something supernatural can happen. Communion teaches us that what God has done, remember what God is doing, and remember what God will do. So as we take communion today, I want to challenge you, even as you approach the table in a moment, to just think and remember those things specifically. Maybe it's steps as you come up to the table to get the elements where you're just remembering God's faithfulness, remembering how God answered prayers, remembering previous seasons where you were on the struggle bus and didn't think there was light at the end of the tunnel, and God brought you out of that, and here you are today. And then as you get those elements, you walk back to your seat thinking, well, shoot, man, well, if God did it back then, can he do it again? Man, if I trusted God back then and he worked everything out for my good and for his glory, why don't I trust him today? Why don't I lean in today? Why don't I renew my faith and confidence in him today? The importance and significance of remembering who Jesus is and what he's done for you. So our worship team is going to lead us in another song. And I want to ask you, if you just stand up right now with me. We have tables in the front. We have 2 in the back, and 1 table in the balcony for you. Just during this next song, if you would just move to the table that's closest to you, grab the juice and the bread, and would you just take it back to your seat so that we can take it together. But I want to challenge you with every step. It's a heart of gratitude, thanking God for what he's done and for who he is, and believing God for even more as we move forward in faith together. God, thank you. Thank you for the sacrifice of your son, Jesus. I pray that you would help us to remember, to recall your previous blessings, your past faithfulness in our life, that it would serve as fuel for future faith and trust and confidence in you, that you're still working, that the God of the resurrection on Easter Sunday is the same God of the resurrection in Acts 20 and the same God of the resurrection in 2024. So God, prepare our hearts right now as we prepare to remember what you've done, who you are, what you're doing in our midst right now. Ask and pray that in your son, Jesus' name. Amen.